The world knew Richard Sterling as a man who could bend steel and stone to his will. In the glittering canyons of the city, his name was etched into the sky, a symbol of power and success. He moved through life with a confident stride, his voice a command that could quiet a boardroom and launch 1,000 careers. Deals were his art, and the market was his canvas. He built an empire, piece by piece, with the same sharp focus and relentless drive that defined him. But when the heavy gates of his private estate swung shut behind his car, the titan of industry would shrink, his broad shoulders seeming to narrow under the weight of a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. His home was a masterpiece of architecture and design, a sprawling mansion of cool marble, polished wood, and vast empty spaces. It was a house that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum. The air inside was always a perfect climate-controlled temperature, carrying the faint, sterile scent of lemon polish. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of a world that Richard had built but could no longer fully participate in. This was his kingdom, and in it, he felt utterly powerless. His entire world had shrunk to the size of one person, his 10-year-old son. Leo. 2 years ago, a car accident had stolen Leo's sight. In an instant, the vibrant, noisy, colorful world his son had known had been replaced by a world of darkness, sounds, and textures. And Richard, a man who solved problems for a living, found himself facing a problem he couldn't fix. He couldn't buy back his son's eyesight. He couldn't order a new reality. This helplessness was a foreign, suffocating feeling, and it had transformed him. His love, once expressed through shared adventures and playful laughter, had hardened into a fortress of overprotection. He filled Leo's room with the best of everything, or at least what he thought was the best. The toys were all custom-made, with no sharp edges, no small parts to swallow. They were smooth, safe, and utterly boring. They were objects of touch, but they held no stories, no wonder. He hired a team of specialists, occupational therapists, tutors for the blind, child psychologists who would come and go, their clinical efficiency only adding to the coldness of the house. They gave Richard reports and progress charts, but they couldn't give him back his son's smile. Leo, who once used to run through these long hallways with the joyful abandon of a puppy, had become a quiet, shadowy figure. He spent most of his days sitting in the bay window of his room, a small, still shape silhouetted against the light. He wasn't looking out at the manicured gardens or the sparkling pool. He was just listening to the wind in the trees, the distant chirp of a bird, the lonely tick of the clock. His world had become small and internal, and Richard, in his desperate attempt to shield him from every possible danger, had unintentionally become the jailer of his son's spirit. Richard would often stand outside Leo's closed door, his hand raised to knock, but then he would lower it. What would he say? How was your day? The answer was always the same. Fine. A quiet, one-word answer that felt like a door being gently closed in his face. He would go in, sometimes, and sit on the edge of the perfectly made bed. He would talk about his day, about mergers and acquisitions, words that meant nothing to the boy. He was trying to bridge a gap with the wrong materials. He was speaking the language of the boardroom to a child who needed the language of the heart. He remembered, with a painful ache, a time before the accident when Leo would climb all over him, his small hands grabbing at his face, his laughter echoing in the office. Now, when he touched his son's arm, Leo would often flinch, startled by the sudden contact. Moving through this quiet, sorrowful world was Elena, the maid. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a presence so quiet she was almost invisible. To Richard, she was simply part of the system, a reliable function that kept the grand machine of the house running. She would appear in a room, dust and polish until everything gleamed, and then vanish, leaving only the scent of lemon wax behind. He paid her salary and barely gave her a second thought, but Elena saw things Richard was too blinded by his own grief to see. As she moved through the vast, empty rooms, she saw the sadness clinging to the walls like a damp chill. She saw the expensive, untouched toys in Leo's room. She saw the dinner trays that were returned from the boy's room barely touched. And she saw the father, a powerful man who looked lost and broken whenever he looked at his son. She would often pause in her work, her dusting cloth in hand, and watch Leo sitting by the window. Her heart ached for the lonely little boy. She saw not a blind child, but a child who was starving for connection, for knowledge, for a piece of the real world. She had been a teacher in her home country for 20 years before life had forced her to leave and seek work as a maid. She knew the spark of curiosity in a child's eyes, and she could see a faint, flickering ember of it in Leo, an ember that was being slowly smothered by fear and silence. She saw how Richard's love had become a cage, beautiful and gilded, but a cage nonetheless. And as she went about her duties, a quiet resolve began to form in her mind. This boy didn't need more toys or more specialists. He just needed someone to teach him how to live in the dark. The heavy oak door of the mansion closed behind Richard with a soft, final thud that echoed in the cavernous entryway. He was home early. A last-minute cancellation of a multi-million-dollar merger. A deal he had spent 6 months cultivating had left a sudden, gaping hole in his afternoon. He should have been furious, pacing his office and barking orders into the phone. Instead, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The city, with its relentless noise and ambition, felt 1,000,000 miles away. All he wanted was the quiet of his own home. A place to shed the armor of the CEO and just be a father. He loosened his tie, the silk feeling like a noose around his neck, and placed his leather briefcase on the marble floor. The house was as it always was, immaculate, silent, and cool. A faint scent of lemon polish hung in the air, a testament to Elena's quiet, efficient work. He expected to find the same profound, heavy silence that usually greeted him, a silence that was broken only by the lonely ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He was used to it, this silence. It had become the soundtrack to his life with Leo, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But today was different. As he walked towards the grand staircase, intending to change out of his suit, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. It was a sound so out of place, so alien in this world of hushed tones, that for a moment he thought he was imagining it. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, followed by a low, gentle murmur of a voice. It was coming from upstairs. From Leo's room. His first thought wasn't of joy, but of intrusion. Who was in his son's room? The specialists were all scheduled for later in the week. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. His mind raced through a dozen possibilities, each one more alarming than the last. An intruder? A reporter who had somehow gotten past the gates? His protective instincts, honed to a razor's edge in the last 2 years, kicked in. He moved silently, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the plush runner that lined the hallway. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was a father guarding his cub. As he got closer to the slightly ajar door of Leo's room, another sound drifted out, and this one stopped his breath in his throat. It was a laugh. Not just a quiet chuckle, but a real, genuine, bubbling laugh of delight. It was a sound he hadn't heard from his son in so long, he had almost forgotten what it sounded like. It was the sound of sunshine, of life, of the boy Leo used to be. The knot of anxiety in his stomach loosened, replaced by a wave of profound confusion. Who could make his son laugh like that? He peered through the narrow opening, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scene that met his eyes was so unexpected, so utterly baffling, that for a long moment he could only stare. It was Elena, the maid. She was sitting on the floor of Leo's room, her plain gray uniform a stark contrast to the expensive, pastel-colored rug. She wasn't cleaning. She wasn't dusting or polishing. She was sitting cross-legged, a small collection of objects spread out on the floor in front of her. And sitting opposite her, leaning forward with an expression of intense concentration, was Leo. In Elena's hands was a simple wooden spoon, one from the kitchen. She had taken Leo's small hands in hers and was guiding them over the smooth, curved surface and the rough, textured handle. "Feel this, Leo," she was saying, her voice soft and clear, with a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. "The bowl of the spoon is smooth. It's warm from your hands. But the handle is different. It's rougher. You can feel the grain of the wood, can't you?" Leo nodded, his head tilted to one side, his brow furrowed in concentration. His fingers, which usually lay limp in his lap, were actively exploring the object, tracing its shape and learning its secrets. Richard watched, completely mesmerized. Elena put the spoon down and picked up a set of old brass keys from the floor. "Now this," she said, placing them in Leo's hands. "This is different. It's not warm and smooth. It's cold and hard. And it has sharp edges. Be careful. Feel the teeth of the key. They are jagged. This key is made to open a door." He saw her guide Leo's fingers not just over the keys, but to a small, white card next to them. On the card were a series of raised dots. Braille. She was gently moving his fingertips over the dots. "Key," she said. "K-E-Y. This is how you read the word key with your hands." Richard's mind was reeling. He had spent a fortune on tutors and specialists, on state-of-the-art learning tools and tactile books. And here was the maid, with a spoon and a set of keys, doing more in 5 minutes than all of them had done in months. He saw the way Leo's face, usually a pale, passive mask, was alight with wonder and curiosity. He saw the spark of intelligence in his sightless eyes, a spark he had feared was gone forever. This wasn't just a lesson. It was a conversation. Elena was connecting his son to the real world. One simple object at a time, but then a different emotion began to bubble up inside him, hot and sharp. It was anger. A deep, burning anger. This was an invasion. A complete violation of their privacy and her role. He had hired her to clean his house, to be a silent, invisible part of the background. He had not hired her to teach his son. Who was she to decide what was best for Leo? What if she was teaching him the wrong things? What if she hurt him, emotionally or physically? The thought sent a jolt of panic through him. He saw it as a dangerous overstepping of boundaries, a betrayal of the trust he had placed in her, however minimal that trust was. The beautiful, magical scene in front of him suddenly seemed sinister and threatening, the protective father. In him overpowered the curious observer. He couldn't stand there and watch for another second. Without thinking, he pushed the door open and stepped into the room, his presence like a sudden, cold gust of wind. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice was sharp and accusatory, cutting through the quiet warmth of the room like a knife. The effect was instantaneous. Elena flinched, her head snapping up to look at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fear. But she did not cower. She simply stared at him, her hands frozen in mid-air. Leo, however, reacted much more dramatically. The sound of his father's angry voice was like a physical blow. He recoiled, snatching his hands away as if he had been burned. The wonderful, curious expression on his face vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror. He shrank back into himself, his small body becoming rigid and defensive. The light in his face was extinguished, snuffed out as quickly as a candle flame in a storm. The magic was broken, and in its place was a terrible, familiar silence. The silence that followed Richard's angry words was heavier than any silence he had ever known in the house. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the small, warm world that had just existed in the corner of his son's room. His own breathing sounded loud and harsh in his ears. He stood there, a towering figure in his expensive suit, his fist clenched at his sides, feeling like a giant who had just stomped on a delicate flower garden. Leo had curled into himself, his small body rigid with fear. He had pulled his knees up to his chest and buried his face, trying to become invisible. The wonderful, curious expression that had lit up his face just moments before was gone, replaced by a look of sheer terror. It was the same look he had in the days right after the accident, a look of a lost child in a world that had suddenly become hostile and confusing. Seeing that look on his son's face, a look he himself had put there, sent a sharp pang of guilt through Richard's anger, but he pushed it down. He was the father. He was protecting his son. That's what he told himself. His gaze shifted from his trembling son to the woman kneeling on the floor. Elena, the maid. For a long moment she just stared up at him, her eyes wide with shock. But then something shifted in her expression. The fear melted away, replaced by a quiet, firm resolve. She slowly and deliberately placed the wooden spoon and the keys on the rug as if marking her territory. Then she rose to her feet, not in a hurried, fearful way, but with a slow, deliberate grace. She wasn't a large woman, but in that moment she seemed to stand as tall as he did. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the tension. It wasn't the voice of a frightened employee. It was the voice of a woman who was not afraid of the truth. Richard was taken aback by her calmness. He had expected her to stammer an apology, to beg for forgiveness. He had expected her to be intimidated. Instead, she met his gaze directly, her eyes filled not with defiance but with a deep, unwavering sadness. "Don't Mr. Sterling me," he snapped, his voice still sharp. "What do you think you are doing? I pay you to clean this house, not to do whatever this is." He gestured wildly at the simple objects on the floor as if they were weapons. "You have no right. No qualifications. Who do you think you are, filling my son's head with who knows what? This is unacceptable. You're fired." The word "fired" hung in the air between them. It was his ultimate weapon, the word that always ended arguments, the word that gave him control. But it didn't seem to have any effect on Elena. She simply took a small breath, her shoulders straightening. "Before you fire me." "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice losing none of its calm, "perhaps you should ask me what I was doing? Perhaps you should ask him." She nodded her head ever so slightly in Leo's direction. Richard's eyes flickered to his son, who was still hiding his face. "He's a child. He doesn't know what's best for him." "That's my job, is it?" Elena asked, and the simple question hit him like a physical blow. "Is it your job to let him sit in this room, day after day, alone with his silence? Is it your job to fill his room with expensive, empty toys that have no story, no life? Is it your job to treat him like a fragile piece of glass that might break at any moment?" Her voice grew a little stronger, a little more passionate, but it was never loud. It was the intensity of her belief that gave it power. "I was not teaching him who knows what. I was teaching him that a key is not just a sound, it's a shape that opens a door. I was teaching him that a wooden spoon is not just an object, it's a piece of a tree and it feels different from a piece of metal. I was teaching him that he doesn't need eyes to have a life. He has hands, he has ears, he has a mind that is hungry to learn. And you, in your fear, are starving him." She took a step closer to him, her eyes pleading now. "I have watched you, sir. I have seen the way you look at him. You see his blindness, but you don't see him. You see a tragedy, a problem to be managed. But I see a boy, a bright, wonderful, curious boy who is locked in a cage. And the cage is not his blindness. The cage is this room. The cage is your fear." Richard was speechless. Her words were disarming him, stripping away his anger layer by layer, until all that was left was the raw, ugly truth underneath. He wanted to argue, to shout her down, to reassert his authority. But he couldn't, because everything she was saying was true. "In my country," Elena continued, her voice softening again, "I was a teacher for 20 years. I taught children to read, to write, to see the wonder in the world around them. I know the look of a child's mind when it is engaged. I saw that look in your son's eyes today, for the first time since I started working here. He wasn't just feeling a spoon. He was discovering it. He was laughing. Do you even remember the last time you heard your son laugh, Mr. Sterling?" The question was a dagger to his heart. He couldn't remember. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard that pure, joyful sound. He saw it now, in his mind's eye, the brief, beautiful moment he had witnessed through the crack in the door. And he had destroyed it. "You give him everything money can buy?" she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "But you deny him the one thing he needs, a chance. A chance to learn, a chance to grow, a chance to be a normal little boy. He is so much more than his blindness, but no one is letting him prove it. He doesn't need more protection. He needs a teacher." As she finished speaking, a small sound came from the corner of the room. It was Leo. He had uncurled himself slightly and had turned his head towards the sound of Elena's voice. He slowly reached out a small hand, not towards his father, but towards Elena. It was a simple, trusting gesture. a plea for the one person who had spoken to him of life and discovery. Not fear and safety, seeing that small hand reaching for her? Seeing his son choose her over him broke something open inside Richard. All the anger, all the self-righteousness, all the illusion of control, it all crumbled into dust. He was not a protector. He was a jailer. He wasn't shielding his son from the world. He was hiding the world from his son. The shame that washed over him was so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight, crushing him. He looked at the woman he had just fired, the woman who had seen more deeply into his son's soul in a few weeks than he had in 2 years. He saw not an insubordinate employee, but a person of immense courage and compassion. He looked at his son, who was reaching out for a connection he had been desperately missing, and he felt like a complete and utter failure. The shame that washed over Richard was so profound, so absolute, that it felt like a physical weight crushing him. He stood there, a man who commanded thousands, a man who could buy and sell companies with a phone call, and he felt completely, utterly powerless. He looked at the woman he had just fired, the woman who had seen more deeply into his son's soul in a few weeks than he had in 2 years. He saw not an insubordinate employee, but a person of immense courage and compassion. He looked at his son, who was still reaching out a small hand towards Elena, a silent plea for the one person who had spoken to him of life and discovery, not fear and safety. And in that moment, Richard knew he had to make a choice. He could either cling to his pride and lose his son forever, or he could let it go and try to find him again. He took a deep, shaky breath, the air feeling thick in his lungs. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. He looked at Elena, and for the first time he truly saw her. Not as a maid, not as an employee, but as a teacher. A guide. He saw the kindness in her eyes, the strength in her posture, and the genuine love she had for his son. "Elena," he said, and his own voice surprised him. It was quiet, rough, and stripped of all its usual authority. It was just the voice of a man who was lost. "Please, don't go?" Elena's expression softened, but she remained still, waiting. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was standing in the center of the room. He felt clumsy, out of place in his expensive suit amidst the simple, tactile world she had created on the floor. He looked down at his son, who had slowly lowered his hand but was still turned towards Elena's voice. "You were right," Richard continued, the words feeling strange and difficult to say. "Everything you said. You were right." He sank to his knees, the fine wool of his trousers pressing into the thick rug. He didn't care. He felt he needed to be smaller, to be on their level. "I've been so afraid," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I was so scared of him getting hurt, of the world being too cruel for him, that I built a wall around him. But I didn't realize I was the one inside the wall with him. I didn't realize I was the one keeping the world out." He looked up at Elena, his eyes filled with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone. "You're not fired," he said, a sad, small smile touching his lips. "In fact, I have a new job for you. Please, continue teaching him, and, please, teach me." The next morning, Richard found Elena in the kitchen, preparing Leo's breakfast. The air in the house already felt different. It was lighter, less heavy with unspoken grief. He walked in, not as the master of the house, but as a humble student. "Good morning," he said, his tone still a little awkward. Elena turned and gave him a warm, knowing smile. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling." "Richard," he corrected her. "Please call me Richard." Over the following weeks, Richard's world was turned upside down in the most beautiful way. He kept his promise. He sat in on Leo's lessons, not as a supervisor, but as a participant. At first he just watched. He watched in awe as Elena used the most ordinary things to build a world for his son. She would bring in leaves from the garden and teach Leo the difference between the smooth, waxy leaf of a magnolia and the rough, serrated edge of an oak leaf. She would let him smell spices from the kitchen, sharp cinnamon, fragrant vanilla, earthy cummin, described the foods they came from. She would tap out rhythms on a small drum, teaching him about music and vibration, and soon, the quiet house was often filled with the sound of Leo's laughter and his own tentative drumming. One afternoon, During a lesson about different textures, Elena placed a piece of fine sandpaper and a piece of velvet in Leo's hands. Richard, watching from a chair, decided to try something. He closed his own eyes. It was a strange and disorienting experience. The familiar world of his study vanished, replaced by a darkness that was total and complete. He could hear the soft scratch of Leo's fingers on the sandpaper, the gentle hum of the air conditioner, the distant chirping of a bird outside. He had heard these sounds 1,000 times, but now, without his sight, they seemed sharper, more meaningful. He reached out and picked up the piece of velvet. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the soft, plush pile give way under his touch. He had never really felt velvet before. He had only seen it. Now, he understood its softness in a whole new way. He opened his eyes and looked at his son, who was exploring the sandpaper with a look of intense focus. He realized that Leo wasn't missing out on the world. He was just experiencing it in a different way. A way that was, in many ways, more intimate, more detailed. He wasn't just seeing a leaf. He was feeling its life, its texture, its very structure. Inspired, Richard began to participate more actively. He started talking to his son again, but this time he spoke a new language. He described his day not in terms of numbers and deals, but in sensory terms. "Today was a loud day, Leo," he would say. "The phone rang like an angry bird, and the papers on my desk felt rough and important. But I shook a man's hand, and his hand was strong and warm, just like yours." One evening, he sat with Leo on the floor, just the two of them. "You know how I run my company?" he asked. Leo nodded. "Well, it's like a giant orchestra. All the different departments are like instruments. The sales team is the loud, booming brass section. The engineers are the precise, careful violins. And sometimes they all play their own tune and it's just noise. But my job is to be the conductor. I have to listen to all of them, all at once, and help them find the rhythm, so they can all play the same beautiful song together." He took Leo's hands and clapped them together in a slow, steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, he counted. That's the beat of the business. That's the rhythm that holds it all together. Leo giggled, clapping along with him, his face bright with understanding. In that moment, Richard wasn't just a CEO teaching his son about his job. He was a father, sharing his world with his boy. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the world was a place they could share together. He saw that Elena's lessons were not just for Leo. They were for him, teaching him how to be a father again, not just a guardian. A few months passed, and the transformation in the Sterling household was nothing short of miraculous. The heavy silence that had once clung to the walls like a damp fog had been replaced by the gentle, everyday sounds of a life being lived. The house now echoed with the soft tapping of Leo's cane as he learned to navigate the hallways, the rhythmic beat of a small drum as he and Elena explored music, and, most importantly, the sound of his father's laughter. Leo was no longer a shadow in his own home. He was a curious, engaged 11-year-old who was discovering the world on his own terms. He would spend hours in the garden with Elena, feeling the different shapes of leaves, smelling the flowers, and listening to the buzz of the bees. He had learned to read simple Braille stories, his fingers flying across the pages with a confidence that made Richard's heart swell with a pride so powerful it almost hurt. The boy who had once been afraid to touch anything was now eager to explore everything, his hands constantly moving, questioning, and learning. And Richard, the titan of industry, had found a new kind of power. He had learned to let go of the fear that had governed his life for so long. He learned that love wasn't about building a fortress to keep danger out. It was about giving his son the tools to navigate the world with all its bumps and sharp edges. He would come home from work, not with a sense of dread, but with a feeling of anticipation. He would find Leo and Elena in the middle of a lesson, and he would join them, not as the boss, but as a fellow student. He learned to describe the world through sound, smell, and touch, and in doing so, he began to see the world with a new clarity himself. One evening, Richard sat Leo down. "I'm hosting a big party next weekend, Leo," he said. "A gala for all my business partners, for the people I work with. It's going to be a very important night." Leo's face fell. He knew what these parties were like. They were for grown-ups, full of boring talk and clothes that felt stiff and scratchy. "Do I have to go?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Richard said, his voice gentle but firm. "But this one will be different. I promise. And I need you there with me. And Elena, too." The night of the gala, the mansion was transformed. The ballroom, which usually sat empty and silent, was filled with the soft glow of chandeliers, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the low murmur of 100 conversations. The city's most powerful and wealthy people were there, dressed in their finest, their faces glowing in the warm light. They were all there to see Richard Sterling, the man who had it all. Richard stood at a podium at the front of the room, a sea of expectant faces looking up at him. He looked confident, polished, the same man who commanded boardrooms. But his heart was beating a little faster than usual. He scanned the crowd, his eyes finding Leo, who was sitting at a table in the front with Elena. Leo looked small and a little overwhelmed, but Elena had placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began, his voice clear and strong. "Thank you all for being here tonight. For years I have stood in front of crowds like this and talked about success. I've talked about market shares, about profits, about building an empire that will last. And for a long time I believed that was my legacy. The company I'd built with my own 2 hands." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The audience nodded, familiar with this narrative. "But I was wrong," he continued, and a ripple of confusion went through the crowd. "My true legacy has nothing to do with steel or glass or numbers on a screen. My true legacy is learning to see the world through my son's eyes." He gestured towards Leo. A soft murmur went through the room as people turned to look at the small, blind boy. "My son Leo lost his sight a few years ago," Richard explained, his voice softening. "And in my grief I made a terrible mistake. I tried to build a world for him that was safe and soft and completely empty. I thought I was protecting him, but I was actually imprisoning him. I was starving his spirit." He took a deep breath. "The person who taught us both how to see is standing right here." He turned and held out a hand to Elena. "Elena, would you please join me?" A wave of whispers washed through the ballroom. People looked at each other, confused. Elena, the quiet woman who had been serving them canapes all evening, hesitated, then walked to the stage, her face a mixture of fear and confusion. Richard put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This is Elena," he said, his voice filled with an emotion that no one had ever heard from him before. "When I hired her, I thought I was hiring a maid. I was wrong. I was hiring a teacher, a guide. She is the one who saw that my son was not a problem to be managed, but a brilliant mind waiting to be unlocked. She is the one who taught him that a key is not just a sound, but a shape that opens a door. She is the one who taught me that the greatest measure of a man is not what he has, but what he is willing to see in others." The room was silent now, every eye on the stage, every person captivated by the raw honesty in his voice. "So, tonight, I am not here to talk about my company. I am here to announce a new venture, the most important one I will ever undertake. I am endowing a new institution, a state-of-the-art academy dedicated to empowering children with visual disabilities. A place where they won't be seen as less, but as more. A place where they will learn not just to navigate the world, but to conquer it. We will call it the Sterling Elena Academy." A wave of polite applause started to ripple through the crowd. It was a generous donation, a worthy cause. It was what they expected, but Richard held up his hand for silence. "There's one more thing," he said, his eyes finding Elena's. "This academy will not be run by a board of directors. It will not be led by a CEO with a fancy degree. It will be led by the one person who truly understands what these children need. The person with the true vision." He turned to face the stunned crowd directly, his voice ringing with conviction. "Elena, a woman I once saw only as a maid, is the one with the true vision. She will not be an employee at this academy. She will be its director." The ballroom was utterly silent for a full 10 seconds. You could hear a pin drop. People stared, their mouths slightly agape. They looked from the powerful millionaire on the stage to the simple, humble woman standing beside him. It was an announcement so unexpected, so radical, so completely contrary to the way their world worked, that they were struck dumb. And then a single person started to clap. Then another. And another. Soon, the entire room erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. It wasn't just applause for a charitable donation. It was an acknowledgement of a profound act of humility, of respect, and of love. In that moment, Richard Sterling didn't just give a woman a job. He gave her a platform, a voice, and the public recognition she had deserved all along. He stunned everyone by showing them all that the greatest wealth isn't in a bank account, but in the courage to see the humanity in every single person.